My name is Justin Cowne. I'm here today to talk about the Battle of Zarqa that occurred on the January 28th of 2007 into January 29th. I was a part of the Charlie Company 2-3 Infantry Regiment that was a battalion under the 3rd Brigade 2nd Infantry Division during the time of the fight. My role was a company fire support officer, and I come from the University of North Georgia military school, family background of service all the way back to the Revolutionary War, and service has been something that's always been important to me, and what I wanted to do when I originally went into school after high school. Served as a artillery officer on active duty for 4 years. The 06-07 deployment being my only active duty deployment, and then later went into the reserves for another 13 years as an intelligence officer for about 4 or 5 or so years after that, and then wanted to get back tactical and went civil affairs and commanded a company out of Tampa, Florida, and did a short little stint down into Central South America region with that command, and then over to U.S. Indo-PACOM as a strategic planner, where I finished out my career as an O4. So that was my
That's awesome.
service time, and then I've been in the medical sales industry for my civilian career ever since I got off active duty, and I currently work for the Mayo Clinic Laboratories.
Okay, that's awesome, man. Well, thank you for all your service. And so you said that was your only deployment, or you joined, you did all your school, so you were part of the train up and everything before that deployment.
Yes, after OBC, I went straight to Fort Lewis, Washington, joined 3rd Brigade, 2nd Infantry Division, was immediately assigned to be a company fire support officer under 2-3 Infantry. And they had just gotten back probably in the fall of '04, I think, and they were in the middle of, the beginning of reset. So I was the fire support officer all through reset and then the train up with a short stint in NTC out there in Fort Irwin, and then we deployed in June of 2006, and I was a part of the Advon there, and went into Kuwait and helped do the download a bunch of the port equipment as an additional duty there.
No, sounds like you got the dreaded UMO task or UMO.
Yes, it's exactly what I got.
uh, yeah, the dread of all officers getting that additional duty of UMO.
Yeah.
Okay, so you're in Kuwait. You guys do your required theater stuff. You head north, pick it up from there.
Yeah, so we go to Mosul first, thinking it's really going to be largely a policing function, a foreign internal defense mission, really working with the Iraqi army and Iraqi police. My company, well, let me take a step back. Out of our brigade, they sent 2 battalions really up to Mosul. 520 had the eastern side of the city, and 2-3, or excuse me, 520 had the western side, and 2-3 took the eastern side of the city. And so my company had the southeastern section of Mosul and focused on that. And so we were there. I went in late July, advoned into Iraq early as well, and then we were there until I think like the first week of December. But really working a lot with the Iraqi army, Iraqi police. That was a pretty definitely not any huge fights, but we definitely dealt with a lot with IEDs and things of that nature. One of the crucial decisions that'll play later into this discussion, and it may have even been a part of your Bakuba stories as well, was when we showed up, the brigade did not think we were going to be doing a lot of fire support missions, and so all of our forward observers were taken from us across the brigade and assigned to military transition teams.
Mm.
So the only real fire support folks we had were the company level FIST. So the FSO, the FSNCO. I was fortunate to be able to keep one of my FOs And then, my driver were the only 13 series folks within the company, because they didn't think we would be doing much within the urban environment. A lot of shooting, mostly rotary wing aircraft and things of that nature, which in Mosul was a lot of Kiowas up there. But that would play later. Most of my, I would say I'm pretty fortunate. Most of my peers really ended up being kind of operations officers for their company commanders and stayed on the FOB. But my company commander at the time, Captain Brent Clemmer, was a former Ranger, platoon leader, and he said that he always wanted his fire supporters with him, and so every mission he went out, which was every day, he was like, "You're coming with." So I rolled out the majority of the time. So we were in Mosul. This is '06 time frame. The war is not going well. Largely, the Shia and Sunni insurgency was really kind of starting in June of 2006. Basically, right after we got there, due to the Shia mosque being hit by a suicide car bomb that killed almost 200 civilians and really kicked off a civil war or ethnic war between the two. And around that time frame, December, November time frame, Rumsfeld steps down, and Secretary Gates comes in, and General Keane, is one of President Bush's advisors, recommends the surge. And so there was currently a Stryker brigade that we had replaced in Mosul, the 172nd out of Alaska. And they were only supposed to be there 12 months as well. But in July, when we got there, they rotated out in August and were extended additional 2 months to about 14 months deployment, but went down to Baghdad to support down there. And so when they rotated out, there was a bit of a gap. And then we came in December. And so the majority of the brigade really was doing clearance operations under Colonel Stephen Townsend, who later became AFRICOM commander. But he was really in charge of clearance operations for the new brigades that were coming in as a part of the surge. And our role as Charlie Company is, our specific company had been assigned to MNDB directly, Major General Phil, to be really his QRF/reserve force. And so, we would kind of go days without anything, and then all of a sudden it was, knee-jerk reaction, and we were jumping out the FOB and heading places. And so we participated really through December in a lot of the big division level operations, clearing in and around Sadr City, Christmas time period, New Year's. And so we were really kind of operating in that area. And then early January, an interestingly historical event happens, was the joint security compound in Karbala gets overrun. And it's about 9 p.m. at night, and I remember I was literally on instant messenger with my wife, and had our walkie-talkies on, and I get an alert to we got to roll out. There's American soldiers have just been overwhelmed south of us, and several have been kidnapped. And so we jumped in our Strykers and drove 2 hours down there, and unfortunately 3 of those soldiers were kidnapped and executed on the side of the road. The Iraqi police were actually able to recover their remains. This ends up being kind of an interesting story or side story, because that operation was planned by Soleimani from Iran and led by another gentleman, I can't remember, a guy who was a Quds Force, Iranian Quds Force guy. And later he would be captured, and he was the very last American prisoner released to the Iraqis on December 31st, 2011, when Obama pulled everybody out and we drove across the border. And obviously, you know the story probably of Soleimani back in 2016 being droned in outside Mosul. But I have a personal connection with this because I found out later that this guy who led the attack in Karbala also was the planner for the Beirut embassy bombing. And my father was on board an aircraft carrier when I was about a year or so old when that happened, responded to that in the Mediterranean. And so here we are, generation apart, responding to the uh, same guy, Hezbollah, Iranian type affiliated folk. But anyways, we're down there, and we end up MNDB detaches us or loans us to 4th Brigade, 25th Infantry Division, who had lost a whole battalion out to Anbar province to support the Marines. And they asked us to stay at Fob Kalsu, which was about 2 hours or so south of Baghdad, drive-wise. For us and strikers, we can go about 60 miles an hour in those things, so we can kind of fly. But the whole company goes down there for this, and then for about 2 weeks, we start prosecuting these targets and going after the guys that did the attack on the Karbala compound. And roll up some of the Iraqi insurgents that were Shia insurgents that were a part of it, and we're there. And then 425 says, "Hey, can you help us out with some other stuff?" And so now it's January 28th, and we are planning for, or actually rehearsing, taking over a farm complex that they're saying has a bunch of insurgents on, doing a company level. We were planning on air assaulting and so this is a bunch of striker guys who've been largely attached to their vehicles, very urban. So we were on the fob in Kalsu, and we're, doing our best to kind of rehearse this, and, practicing calls for fire, dismounted, which I hadn't done since I deployed. It had all been, mounted in the vehicle up until this point. And it's about, I don't know, 2 or 3 o'clock in the afternoon, 1500 or so on that day, and we get alerted that there's an Apache down. And so we're just told, hey, we're going to escort a flatbed and a wrecker to load this stuff up, the Apache, onto the flatbed and get it out and recover the pilots. And that's really all we know, fog of war, at the time frame. And so, we hustle, we get into our strikers, and we just take off, and we are flying. We have to go through this Shura event that's happening in Hilla, and slows us down, and have to get through this. And as the fire support officer, I had a fire support vehicle which had a pretty large laser on it that could see out 19 kilometers, and could also designate when it worked properly, which it never did. And so we had that, but it really came with something that was super unique for strikers. It had a third radio antenna. And so for most of the deployment, my Captain Clemmer used me as his glorified radio man. And so I would be on the company net, I'd be on a battalion net, and then whatever other net he wanted me to be on, sometimes brigade, so that I could hear trickle down of orders and give him a heads up with things. And so we're driving down there, and he calls me, and he had gotten a digital message from battalion saying, hey, there's an SF team on station. Here's their single channel ciphertext net. And so he gives it to me. He's like, see if you can get contact with them, let them know we got 176 infantrymen and 17 strikers rolling to them right now. And so I get on, and I call, and I call, and I call, and I get no response. And then I get screaming. And it's two entities going back and forth, and they never respond to me for about 5 minutes. So after that kind of stops, I call back again, and I finally get a call sign Xiphos that responds to me and proceeds to say, hey, I need you to hold on. We're in contact with 9 enemy right now trying to get to the crash site. And so I said, okay, that was the last conversation I had with Xiphos, but I told Captain Clemmer, Charger 6 was his call sign. I'm just like, hey, Charger 6, this is Charger 5-3. They're in contact with 9 enemy. We chuckle because we're just like, yeah, they're going to see 17 strikers roll up and they're just going to run like they always do whenever we get the attack. But still, at this point in time, I have no idea that what had led to these events was the night before there was apparently this Shura holiday. There was some altercation between the Iraqi security forces and this group, which later we would come to know is called the Soldiers of Heaven. And
Wow.
never heard of it at that point in time. And they had some sort of altercation that led to a shooting at a checkpoint. And so the next day, in the morning time frame, an Iraqi Army scout platoon that was synced with a 5th SF team down in this area went to go check out where these guys were. And it was a farming village called Zarca. So I always call this the Battle of Zarqa, not the Battle of Najaf, because we were like 3 or 4 kilometers out, but the media has Najaf written all over it. And
Yeah,
as
it
you
gets a
said
little
in your email earlier, right, there's like multiple battles of Najaf. So it's which one are we talking about here?
gets a little confusing there, and then also, the big Najaf clearing of '04. But yeah,
Go for
it's
it. Yeah.
you know, but yeah, so there you are, a few clicks out of Najaf, but you're still down in that
Yeah.
area.
Yeah. So apparently this scout platoon had uh, come up to this, what turned out to be a compound, and
Okay.
got into a near side ambush. About 40 of them, and they were all killed. And the enemy took their Humvees, all their equipment, pulled it into this kind of this burned in compound. And so the SF team responded, and there was this north south road that ran right along this, I would say, probably a 5 to 6 foot berm that had been purposely dug up by this organization. And they had created basically themselves a 3-sided berm with the Euphrates on the backside around this kind of farm village. And then it was dug a trench on the opposite side of the berm that ran like an L from the north to south and then east west on the southern side.
And I know we're looking in hindsight and talking, but everything you're describing points to this isn't your local insurgent.
Right, right. Yeah.
The Sons of Heaven, right? That was their names. The Sons of
Soldiers are doing, yeah, yeah.
Your soldiers. There we go. Soldiers
Yeah.
of Heaven. This wasn't your traditional farmer insurgent who just didn't like the Americans or the occupiers or whatever their slang they wanted to throw at us. But this group has had some training, could be led by someone that is been trained.
Yeah. Yeah, so again, we didn't know any of this. We didn't know about the scout platoon. The 5th SF team at the time, that ODA responded, drove the exact same road right along the berm, and I mean we are talking 10 feet, and get into another near side ambush, and then get pinned down at the southern corner and begin engaging there. A lot of great stories of how the SAPI plates and helmets took direct 7.62 rounds, and no one was killed on that SF team, which was amazing. But they get 2 Apaches on station, and so those 2 Apaches begin supporting. And again, still unbeknownst to me, they had mounted dishkas on the back of pickup trucks and even like a John Deere trailer on the back of a tractor, and had hid them under some of the palm groves. And so the Apaches started taking pretty heavy fire as they came in, and unfortunately, one of them was shot down and landed in this field crash landed in this field out to the west of the compound, approximately, I would say 300-400 meters away from that berm. And so we're driving down there, don't really know any of this, and we get there, and it's really kind of pulling into about 1600, 1700, and it's starting to get kind of later afternoon, sun starting to come down. We pull up, and we were, the way we had kind of gone down there was we had one platoon up front, then we had the command group there with myself, Captain Clemmer, in the medical vehicle, and the XOs, the second group, and then the rest of the platoons subsequent. And I remember pulling up and seeing a Humvee. I was out of a back hatch as a fire support officer, and I remember pulling up next to a Humvee that had steer horns on the front. I'm like, okay, this is definitely the SF team. And brass casings from their 50 cal piled almost to the top of that front right tire, shotgun side. And I'm just like, what is going on here? And I, again, thinking this is the SF team that I had talked to, it was actually the battalion commander of the SF group was already on station with a MIT, a local MIT there as well. And so we pull in with them. Captain Clemmer jumps out, gets a debrief, still kind of not hearing anything, and all of a sudden I look up and an Apache comes flying right overhead and unleashes a bunch of rockets to a berm off to to the left, out to the east, and so hits out there, and all of a sudden I see it's basically the northern corner of this berm, and I just see about 5 or 6 individuals all clad in black, kind of running around offside this berm. With AKs, and so I start engaging with my M4, realizing my tracers are hitting way low, and I'm like, oh, this is much farther than I think. So start engaging a little bit more, and I start seeing, elevating my shots, and I start seeing some tracers going into the black, but it's just like not doing anything. And so finally, we get my fire support NCO is able to see where they are and starts to engage with the 50 cal out at that distance. And then another Apache comes flying over, and there's a house to the north, and starts engaging the house with rockets and a Hellfire. And I think this was all probably about 400 yards based on the way I was shooting with my tracers. I think I had to elevate another 100 meters beyond the normal 300, right, that we zero at this point in time. So then dark hits, and Captain Clemmer is like, hey, we're going to push forward and get on the other side of this Apache. So we're going to be kind of in the open ground in the middle of this field and create a barrier. At this time, we're the only conventional unit there, and the 05 SF commander has got ground command, and a Spectre comes on station, and they start going to work with their JTAC. And so we still have the mission of just recovering the pilots and the Apache, and that's it. Nothing beyond this attack. We have no idea what's on the other side of this berm, and so we push forward under fire, basically, in our vehicles all the way up about 100 meters or so past the Apache. And now we're about 200 meters from the berm, frontline trace. Unfortunately, we've got our night vision, and they don't really have anything. We later found some night vision that they had, but it was really grainy, pretty poor stuff that they had. And so we get up there. He's like, hey, I want you to establish a mortar firing point. And when we were in Mosul, we never carried mortar ammo. It was more of a fear of a secondary explosion from IEDs. But when we got to Baghdad, commander was pretty concerned, so we carried enough for our 120s and 60s. So we had 2 mounted 120s in our mortar section, and then 2 dismounted 60 tubes at the company level. That was standard. So he's like, set up a mortar firing point on the west side. We had this big perimeter circle going all the way around and he had set up, his command post kind of near the Apache, where all the work was going at that point in time. At this unfortunately time, we realized, the pilots are KIA, and they work to recover them first and foremost. And so we set up the mortar firing point, and then I get the call from Captain Clemmer. He says, "Hey, I want you to push forward with second platoon, which is all the way up there, right on the front trace." Lieutenant Steve Smith at the time was platoon leader for that platoon, and I went up there because we had no FOs, and so it was like, "I want you right up there." So I basically just went in, pulled FO duty up the front with my NCO and our big laser that we could, see, these folks just like right there. And yeah, for the majority of the night, we still had really no idea. Eventually, at some point in time, I talked to the SF team leader that was pinned down to the south. So we found out there was two SF teams now. The original one that got shot up and was stuck down south, and then we knew, of course, of where the battalion commander was with his element. And I start talking to that team leader, and he tells me, he's like, "Man," he goes, "we dropped a 500 pounder on about 100 guys on the other side of the berm," and he was just, adamant. And so I call Captain Clemmer, and I'm like, "Hey, sir, he's telling me that that there were like 100 guys on the other side earlier today before we got there." And he's like, "No way," He goes, "There's no way." Exaggerating the number, fog of war, doesn't believe it. And I'm thinking the same thing because we've never heard, of that many insurgents.
At one place at one time. I mean, mine is your, as we were talking about earlier, mine is the Battle of Najaf, Fallujah. But yes, just a random training camp with 100 dudes.
Yeah,
So yeah, everybody's probably scratching their head like, all right, maybe this guy's been out in the heat a little too long.
yeah, yeah. So so we were really engaging a lot with M4s. I mean, it was you could look up out of your hatch with your nods on, and it was just an IR swirl. And so we had every CAS on station, even the AWACS flew out there and was in the circle, basically stacking aircraft. And so we were deconflicting the whole entire time where we were, and then. And Apaches were kind of coming in, and so I talked to them mostly. So I was talking to the Apache pilots, and we'd get these calls where we couldn't really see what was on the other side of the berm, but the aviation platforms could, or we'd see heads pop up, in our thermals, and we would engage. But it was very difficult to engage with direct fire because they'd pop up, spray, fire an RPG, hop back down, and again, it just seemed like kind of this. But it was snaps and pops constantly, like the entire night long. And so at some point in time, I finally get my first call for fire with mortars, and I call my commander. I'm like, "Hey, I got a target who's engaging us that I could see on the thermal." He's like, "All right, I want to use the 60s on it." I say, "Okay," and we pop it, and it's like boom. And I'd look at my NCO, and we're just staring at the screen, and we're kind of like, "All right, did we hit anything?" And then eventually we see the parts, and so we're like, "Okay." And we announced that over the net for BDA, and I'll never forget the mortar team, just their reaction for that. And then so we went with the 60s for a little while, really just trying to hit on the other side of the trench. And it was a challenge because I wanted to use a time fuse and do an aerial burst to get down into the trench. But we were well within the risk estimate distances for all of the munitions we were dropping, and I was too afraid because the infantry guys had all dismounted and were literally dug in. They had pulled out their E-tools and kind of entrenched themselves. And I was worried that a short air burst would put shrapnel down on our own guys. So we kept just dropping point detonation fuses, and even a couple delayed to see if we could get it deeper into the berm, and then stopped for a while. And then our battalion commander shows up, Lieutenant Colonel at the time, Barry Huggins, who would later command 5th Brigade, 2nd Infantry Division in Afghanistan. He shows up with our Bravo company, and so they come down, and the battalion mortars, and so they come down, and Bravo goes down to the south and finally secures the SF team, maybe about 2,200-ish hours at that time, and so then he takes full command of the whole battlefield, relieves the SF company or battalion commander, but that guy stays so that we could keep the Spectre through the night, because they won't support unless there's no SF there. And so we really just kind of we've got A-10s running gun runs, 15s, F-15s dropping stuff. There were British Tornadoes on station, Predator that was up there as well. I didn't find out half that until I got back later. But we really went to work from about 2,200 to 2,400 with Apaches. And it was just, consistent. Some of my greatest calls for fire was with those guys. But the one that everyone laughs about now was we spotted 2 guys bounding in the open. I had that with AKs, and I call Clemmer, and he had gotten out of the vehicle and was managing the recovery of the Apache, because again, that was the mission. And so he doesn't answer, so I got to call Huggins. I call Colonel Huggins, and I tell him, he's like, okay, I'll take that as hostile intent given the situation. He's like, you're clear to engage. And so I call the Apaches back, and I'm like, okay, yeah, you're cleared hot from north-south using guns. And the Apache pilots call me back, and they're like, yeah, we're out of guns. Request permission to use rockets. And one of my platoon leaders jumps on the net and is like, Maverick, we're out of missiles, switching to guns. And so, using that whole Top Gun line. And then so they engage with flechette rounds and on that. But yeah, so that really kind of went until about, all that really continued till about 04. We tried to issue some surrender appeals and got on bullhorns with our interpreters. At about 02, they responded with RPG fire back at us, so we just kept going for another 2 hours. And then at 04, a group massed, and we put a 1,000 pounder on it. I mean, like 300 yards from us.
So just to clarify, what was your estimate on this group, or describe this group?
Yeah, I mean, the enemy, you mean?
Yeah, you said a group mass. So what?
Oh, yeah. I mean, I heard it was probably about 25 or so individuals. We had heard about it before. Earlier, I had fired some 120s at a group that had massed around 120s. We didn't see it, and that one, the Spectre actually was like, "Hey, our tubes are too hot." Like that's how much they were firing, and they told me the location. And then I adjusted 120 rounds, and it was actually the very first time an HE round was fired out of the mounted 120 Striker platform. And,
Like in combat?
Yeah, in combat, yeah.
Okay.
And so we had some pretty good effects with that, but again, still struggling with a non-aerial burst, whereas the stuff from the sky was able to get a lot more direct with it. But anyways, about 04, another group or so of around 25 people mass, and we just hear, I believe it was an F-15 just coming in, and I'll never forget the screaming of how low that was. And then just like everybody's pucker factor, getting small as this thing just streams in. And I remember vividly hearing the release of the ordnance click. That's
wow.
Closest thing was. And then boom, and I had gotten down in my Striker because I was looking at maps and my digital stuff and looking through the screen, but my NCO was up and decided to watch the thing, and comes falling down. It had flipped the concussion of the blast and flipped his nods up, and he started laughing. He was like, "Whoa, that rung my bell." And I was like, "I told you to get down." But curiosity killed the cat, right? Anyways, Um, it went quiet after that, dead silent, and we didn't shoot at them. They didn't shoot back at us after that impact. And then they started planning for the following morning at dawn. Colonel Huggins had made the decision. We were getting really low on ammo. We were probably like almost to red. I know the second platoon was already red on ammo from all the shooting they had done, and mind you, we had all kinds of containers in our vehicles of ammo that they were just constantly kind of replacing. So the plan was for us to unfurl our kind of arc around the Apache, push all the way up to the berm and set a support by fire position right there. And then Bravo Company went all the way to the south and had lined up and was going to be the assaulting entity, because they didn't do a lot of shooting in the evening. Most of it had kind of massed towards us, so they had plenty of ammo. So they line up, and then it's about 06, and we unfurl and we push up to this berm, and I mean we are thinking we are going to be going house to house, room to room, and it is going to be a slugfest direct. We started talking about prepping for casualties, and I was planning on jumping out of the vehicle with my radio man with Captain Clemmer, and doing continuing calls for fire through the fight from a distant line, because we knew we wouldn't be able to get the vehicles past this berm. Well, we drive up to the berm, and I just remember coming up there and seeing a Toyota Hilux that had been destroyed, and enemy KIA kind of all around it that had been thrown. And then there's just munitions everywhere on this side of the berm close to us, just RPGs that were loose that you didn't want to touch because you knew they had probably been hit by some of our explosions. And we get up to the berm, and I kind of have to kind of drive down, and you just see KIA just kind of resting at the top of the berm. I couldn't really see much over the complex, and this really loud explosion goes off. I think somebody said it was a gas line, but I think most of us think that it was ordnance that was like just had been compiled together, enemy ordnance that it was just detonating from. I think fortunately nobody was injured.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
No, so yeah.
Yeah, Bravo Company. I heard a 50 go off from Bravo down south at one point in time, but that was really the only shooting. We get kind of unfurled. We're on the berm, and then they surrender en masse. And so they just line up. And Captain Clemmer always said after, he goes, I think that they sent their hardcore people up first, thinking that we were going to just shoot them as they surrendered. One of the memories that vividly sticks with me is seeing a guy in kind of a gray, long, we used to call them man dresses. I don't know what the technical term was. And his right arm is gone, and he's got blood all the way down to his ankles and blood coming out of his ears. And he's just standing there, kind of staring off into the distance, just waiting his turn to be searched. And so at that point in time, my job as a fire support officer is done for the rest of the fight. Later, one of our NCOs would engage an insurgent who, as they were searching through the other side and that mass surrender and stuff like that, they would, a guy that tried to resist and went for an AK, and so that was the only shots fired really other than the Bravo Company 50 cal.
So this mass, what would you estimate this surrender? Like 25?
At the time, I would say hundreds.
Hundreds. Okay.
Hundreds, yeah. So every striker had concertina wire wrapped on the front that we kept since Mosul, and we had to pull all these things off and create this big pen almost of wire, and we put all the military age males in one, and then women and children separated in another, and then we
Wow,
had
there are
another
women
one.
and children there too.
There were, so a lot of these guys brought their families. We were actually, now if you read the reports on this, it's a lot of lies. But fortunately, there was this depression in the middle of their area that they had put their women and children, and so there was very few civilian casualties. But there was a few hundred of them on top of it, and so they just brought their people. The final tally I was told of civilian KIA was 11
Okay.
total. So comparatively for what was going on, we were very lucky that no munitions went into that spot or anything like that. But still tragic nonetheless for that loss. So they really, at that point in time, really Charlie and Bravo searches the compound. Recover. I mean, this is becomes a mass casualty event. The battalion surgeon had come along with the battalion commander, and he was literally running down the line and was saying things to the effect of, "You can't save that one. Do this thing. Apply pressure here, tourniquet there. We need a medevac for this one. Let that one's gone. Just." I later talked to him, and I think he really struggled with, moral injury and PTSD from just those, that decision alone, and not actually being like the doctor working on them. A lot of medics were doing trauma level stuff to try and save these lives. And Clemmer would always say, he goes, "We went from pulling pins on hand grenades right before when we got up to that berm, to replacing them and providing medical treatment to people who had just been spent the last 18 hours trying to kill Americans." And if that's not the definition of a professional military force, I don't know what is. And I think that I like to share that with people, because that is your American military. I know you know that, Mike, and that's who we are as a organization and as a culture and society. So I was really proud that we were able to do that, and people emotionally managed things. And so we were there until basically dusk that night, recovering, and an Iraqi army battalion had showed up to really relieve us. We recovered the remains of the Apache pilots, we had to detonate the Apache because it was covered in rockets, and so we had an EOD guy, a Navy EOD guy actually, who drove down with us. Was there the whole fight, and detonated that, and then we went back up to Kalsu and the MIT team, and the Iraqi army really kind of took over from there. About 2 weeks later, a military historian showed up in Baghdad, where we were camped at Camp Stryker, and went through really the whole thing with us, and shared that he had interviewed, the SF teams, and we were kind of last, and met with the Air Force guys, and shared that we had made 2 AC-1 Spectre gunships go black on ammo, numerous Apaches, 14 500-pounders, and 2 1,000-pounders during that. And at the time, other than the longer term fights, it was the most ordnance they had released in one day since the invasion. But what no one heard about it, and it barely made news, because at the time, I dare say that the administration did not want to admit that a force that size could mass during the surge, right? So we're 2 months into the surge, and they largely, it's going well. Baghdad's becoming better in control, things like that. And it turned out that the final tally that the historian had shared with us was KIA's 252 enemy, 2 American, another like 40 or so Iraqi army from that initial ambush, and then another 500 detainees. So
Wow.
they estimated the size of the force at around 700. So it went from 9 to 700 in that time. So yeah, that was what we call the Battle of Zarqa.
Wow. Yeah, thank you for sharing.
Yeah,
And that's it's I mean, it's an impressive story, and a lot of we were talking earlier, the connections later on in life with
yeah,
well, Captain Clemmer, and now Colonel Clemmer, and these other individuals. But yeah, I mean, you talk about doing things like you pointed out. And actually, I'd like to say thank you. You're the first one that has talked about where the I call it the MIT purge of what happened to our battalion, but each battalion dealt with it a different way. But the way that your unit dealt with it was taking all the FSO or FSOs or the fire support soldiers and put them into the MIT team. So that was the first time I've heard about that from the striker units. So that's very interesting. But, here you are doing skills that you pretty much didn't do your most of the time in Iraq until you get to this engagement. So now you're calling for fire, you're deconflicting aircraft. Uh, for people that, probably play too much Call of Duty and also, yeah, this was almost 20 years ago. You're doing all this without a digital screen. You're doing this without seeing a bunch of icons and like you pointed out, you're talking to these you barely could talk to the SF guys, but they got their own JTAC. They're doing their own stuff. So there's a lot of deconflicting you're doing so that, no blue on blue, which is impressive.
Yeah, I mean, I was really fortunate. I mean, we did some really ad hoc stuff. So I did have an FBCB2 screen. So thank gosh, because if I didn't have that, we had no paper maps because you don't just carry paper maps for 2 hours away, right? You're going different places, you react to it, and so fortunately, I had that. Otherwise, I would have had to have done like polar calls for fire back to the mortar team, and that would have been, grid is standard. To do it. But at points in times, I was, my infantry guys were calling me, trying to point out directions, and I was literally taking a plastic map protractor and putting it on a digital screen and tapping dots to create perfect lines, and then adjusting to like 100 meters on the map and being like, all right, that's my target, and firing off of it. But yeah, I mean, it's the other
A
thing I was really
digital map.
fortunate. What'd you say?
Yeah, so you're doing all this with just a digital map, but it ain't like the FPCB2s that high speed back then.
Right.
And
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
I mean, you were I don't want to sound like insulting, but you're making it up. I mean, you're grabbing the protractor, you're going to do some bridging analog and digital techniques to get the job done. So, that's awesome.
Yeah. It was a lot of fun from that perspective. Like we look back on it, and kind of caused like I never did it again. I never called for fire in Iraq again on any level of platform. And so it was just, that one day turned out to be pretty intense. And, it does go to show too the training that you go through, leading up and before you deploy, because it was, really relying on a lot of that. And this is 6 months later. Now, fortunately, my fire support team, we would have lots of lulls, right? And whenever we were out and about, and so we would always kind of practice. I would be like, hey, let's pretend there's an enemy target on the top of that building, let's go, when we would time ourselves to the 45-second standard to be able to get a call for fire out. So we would kind of rehearse a lot of that stuff. And I also think I was really fortunate that we were literally practicing it that day for a different mission when we got the call to go down there. So it was like I was ready to go dismounted if we had to, even though I had not done that and since I left, Fort Lewis.
Yeah.
But
I mean, you went
it's
from one farm mission to a different one,
to a
but
different
like
one.
you're saying, you guys were doing those troop leading procedures. You were, I don't know if you were in the middle of a sand table when you got the call, but you were going through those rehearsals, so that speaks highly of your leadership and of your team.
Yeah. Yeah, so I think, yeah, I mean, largely I would say that's pretty much it from that. I think that, I think that I look at your stuff as the aftermath, right? How does this impact
Yeah,
things?
yeah. How does this affect the rest of your career? How has it affected you personally, professionally? And yeah, well, let's pick it up from there.
Yeah, I would say the immediate thing was, we got extended a couple months later, and I left the battalion. As a fire support officer, I've been there over 2 years, which is really kind of rare to see an officer over 2 years, but they didn't want to switch me at the beginning. But I needed to go back to the FA battalion and get my platoon time. So they sent me back to the 137 Field Artillery, which was doing ground operations, no artillery work, north of Baghdad, out of Camp Taji. And so, yeah, then the surge came in. I had a little small battle space just to the east of the Tigris and north of Baghdad, small farming community there that I was in charge of. And then surge comes in, and 4th Brigade, 2nd Infantry Division takes over kind of that whole slice, and then we got kind of the pizza slice. And our battalion commander, we were actually reporting to 1-1 Cav at the time, Colonel Funk, later General Funk, who assigned our battalion to do a bunch of little ad hoc missions, and one of those was HVT, time sensitive target air assault missions. And so here I am now as a FA platoon leader of 22 guys leading air assault missions every night for the last 4 months, going after Al Qaeda targets. And interestingly, this ties into the Bakuba story, because the Anbar awakening had happened, and so Al Qaeda starts fleeing, as you probably know, Anbar province, and it's like, well, they need a new capital. So they start going into Bakuba. Well, they stop in a spot that we called kind of the pizza slice, where it was like this road complex. You get Route Tampa and Taji right here and Baghdad down here, and then this kind of other road that went out, I can't remember. And they would stay in this. It was all farming. It was all dirt roads, and they had deep buried IEDs, huge ones for miles. And it was technically 1-1 Cavs AO, but they could not get any of their armor down there because they'd just get blown up. They go another 100 yards, they get blown up. And even the EOD guys were just overwhelmed with it. But the Al Qaeda guys would come into the pizza slice, stay overnight, do an attack down in Baghdad, go back up, spend the night, and then go back and then head to Baqaba to reinforce Baqaba. Well, around the time that Operation Arrowhead Ripper in Baqaba starts going off, they have my team and platoon and one other platoon. We were kind of rotating missions, doing these air assault missions into the pizza slice, going after these guys using SIGINT to target them. And we just started picking them apart. And between the Arrowhead Ripper operation and really going on there, it was having a big impact on Baghdad. Baghdad started getting quiet. Sadr City ended up being the one that was really the biggest pain, during that time. But obviously the Shia fight, the Sunni fight that we really have going on. But to your earlier question, how does it impact me? Is I had just went from being engaged with 700 insurgents to now being flying out in the middle of nowhere with AQ, foreign fighters and stuff like that. And to be honest with you, it scared the ever-living daylights out of me. I kept thinking, I'm going to roll in with 22 guys and find another Zarka, And so, I led very stressfully. I would say during that time that I think, I've spent a good amount of years since I've been home seeing my old combat buddies. I travel for work, and I like to stop and somebody have a conversation that you never had when you get home, and stuff like that. And so I think it has really caused me to reach out to a lot of folks and engage with them and be a bit of an ambassador. Part of the reason why I reached out to you guys, a bit of an ambassador for these stories. And it was definitely a fight or flight, I think, for a long time after that deployment. But it really impacted a lot of folks. Unfortunately, there's been quite a few suicides from our company. Since we've been home. Probably another historical event was a man by the name of Sergeant First Class Robert Bales. This NCO was a team leader in that battle and was in Afghanistan later as an E7 and walked off of base and executed 16 Afghan civilians and was on the front page of Times Magazine as this generation's My Lai massacre. And in fact, part of his defense, and Captain Clemmer even testified at his trial hearing for that, and he's in Leavenworth for it. So it's, I look at a lot of guys that, that battle, I think, really changed a lot for a lot of folks, but probably the deployment, as a whole. And I think for me, long term, those types of things, they disrupt your family life. They impact you there, and But I've also been able to apply all those leadership lessons to what I do in the civilian sector. And so, like for example, at the Mayo Clinic, I teach leadership development for them as kind of a side project, and I attribute that to all the experience that the service provides NCOs and young officers to be able to, cut their teeth in leadership.
Yeah. And like you were saying, the isolation, I mean, that is great that you are connecting people because isolation is not healthy.
Yeah, for
And
sure.
a big part of this project is the history and healing aspect. And that's for giving people the platform to share their story and to heal from that sharing. But then it's also the second and third order effects of those that hear the story who may have been there or been in something similar, and just to see that it's not just them. And yeah, we've got to do better as a veteran community of coming together and supporting each other. There's enough tearing each other down where
Yeah.
let's help each other, and let's try to reduce that number, that figure, the 22.
Yeah, it's sad. I mean, even my artillery platoon, I lost a couple guys in April after that fight due to an IED, and that whole section now is gone due to suicides since we've been home, and I'm just like. I think that's one of the biggest struggles is realizing now I'm getting to the point where I've lost more people because they still feel like my soldiers, right? It's family. People don't understand what trauma bonding really is like, in many ways. But, I feel like I'm losing more home than I did over there. And I think that if I can maybe get on a pedestal here for a moment about
Yeah, why
mental
not pull the
veterans.
pedestal out, get the soapbox.
Yeah, veterans' mental health. I think that we as a society focus on a lot of the wrong things. And I think most PTSD is this separation from society. I think that veterans come home, they get out, they go back to their house, they're no longer around the people that are really their new family, and there's a disassociation and a disconnection from society that they feel and don't really know how to express. And so then they seek out really kind of bad behaviors to feel something again. And being a veteran separates you from society, but having served in combat is tenfold. Right. I sometimes have sat down with veterans at bars and I see the hat, if I'm traveling for work, or I see the shirt and I strike up a conversation, and I've learned I don't talk about my experiences anymore because if I start to share, I had a guy one time, I said, he's like, oh, did you deploy? I said, 06, 07. And he was like, oh, it was much way worse for you. And then he just shut down. And I'm like, it's not a contest. Like, this isn't a contest, and it's not a badge that I'm, proud to wear, to be honest with you, in that sense. And so, I really want to bring people together. And I think that lastly, that we've overlooked moral injury way too much, and we talk about PTSD like that is all encompassing, and people focus on those kind of techniques to deal with PTSD. And yes, I think it's all combined, but moral injury, I think, is so subtle that it causes a lot of people, especially combat veterans, to make bad decisions because they've gotten to a point where they can justify negative actions, right? And so, I always think of one of the worst things that ever hurt me was what I saw children go through over there. And not the actions I actually did, but the things that I didn't do or couldn't do because I had to go over here and do a completely different, mission. And it haunted me later in life. And it breaks you to a certain extent because now you're something you would never do otherwise in your life, the way you were raised, your morality, your ethics. You do that, and then later other things start to become justifiable, whether that's drug use or alcoholism or spousal abuse. I mean, those are the milder things compared to the suicide. We say 22 a day. I'm like, how many are addicted to alcohol? How many are addicted to drugs? How many divorces, And I think a lot of that's tied to that. So I wish that we as a veteran society would start to talk about moral injury a little bit more, because I think when I share that with some folks, they have this aha moment and they realize that maybe they shouldn't justify their actions so much anymore. So, anyways, that's my
Yeah.
pedestal.
No, I mean, moral injury is very important, and I would not disagree with you on that. And more emphasis placed on helping people through those moral injuries, and just like what you started off with, the loss of identity, and that's what leads to so many people. Just that, I mean, we all see the memes, we see the things. Oh, I can be trusted with a machine gun in combat, but I can't have a hot plate in my room. And
Right.
so there's like that kind of joke of like the things you do in combat, you can't, you don't get that in the civilian world. But then also when you transition from service, that whole loss of you're no
Purpose.
longer with that team, that purpose, the discipline, all those things that just add together. And when you lose it so quickly and you don't fill it with something positive, that's when, like you were saying, a lot of these troubles start brewing to the top.
Yeah. Yeah. Um, I think if I look at Zarka, and I maybe to put a bumper sticker on that is that we used to say it was the most conventional fight in an unconventional war. Berms and armored vehicles and close air support and all those things. And just like I was sharing kind of with the protractor on the digital screen, it's you really have to be able to function with the basics, And so, as we move into an AI digital world significantly, what's going to happen if there's an EMP? Do the soldiers still know how to do their job with math, a calculator and, a map and stuff like that? And, I think that's what makes us good as a force is we're trained in all of those facets and we have amazing command and control. That's why we win wars. It's command and control. NCOs and soldiers being the backbone, of that force. So I would just say that we have to continue to maintain those standards, even though we all could get a little lazy and want to just do the digital stuff the easy way. But had we not done that, had we not kept up with those things, I think that sometimes you talk about purpose, and I wanted to be an infantry officer. Didn't get it. Got my second choice, which was fine. I got artillery. Ended up in an infantry unit. Wound up doing nothing but kind of infantry style work. Found out later that the same infantry battalion I was in, my grandfather was in the 50s, which is just a rarity. And then later in life, he became an artillery officer. He had to switch when he went into the National Guard. And my middle name is named after Robert Cowne, who was an artillery officer for General Washington during the Revolutionary War. So sometimes I think that day was my purpose. But, really just, doing all the training and doing the things that you need to do to be able to, do it when you need to.
Yeah, I mean, wow, you talk about a family called to service, and service obviously has deep meaning to you. So that is an amazing story to have.
Yeah, yeah, it's kind of interesting. I didn't find out until after my deployment, so it's like all of that.